Hi, this is Pooka, and we're carrying on with our animated sculptures tutorial. Going to move on now to relative movement and connectors after having covered the basics of scale and effects. Everything here is done with keyframes on a timeline, and this is a bit of a more complex animation, but it's still just a series of scale changes and movements often do require connectors when you're animating. And I'm going to explain why that is by showing a little sample that I made. I'm going to go back. The Magic Beanstalk, as I said, is a bit complex because it's a lot of parts. I'm going to show a simpler version of that, the growing tendril. This is part of the beanstalk. You see this tendril animate out, and as you can see, it just grows up pretty smoothly, and all the pieces look aligned as it grows out. I'll show what happens if you don't use connectors to do this type of an animation. I'm going to show this in edit mode so I can scope in and out here. As we watch it grow, you can see how the different parts of it kind of don't stay together and they move around each other in a kind of a funky way, and that's when you need connectors. If you just want something to move from one point to another within a scene, then you can often do that with a keyframe and no connectors. But this kind of movement, you do need connectors. And so I'll open up the timeline here, and I'm just going to delete that keyframe. And now we're back to our original tendril here, which is grouped together. I'm going to ungroup that. And I actually have a series of groups here, which I'm going to undo all of those. If you're starting with something that's a sculpture you've made or that someone else has made and there's a lot of parts grouped together, before you start animating, it's important to think about how those groups are working, whether they're working to your advantage, and oftentimes you're going to need to ungroup things. So this tendril is made out of, each of these is just one sculpture. So if I scope in, this is just made using the curve shape, and it's just one of those that's repeated and scaled down. That's the whole tendril there. To place a connector, you go into the connectors gadgets. There are different connectors that are useful in animations. The ball joint is the one I'm using here, and it's the same one that's used for the puppet, the default puppet. So it's also important the order that you do things. For this to move in the right way, it's better to start up at the top rather than down at the bottom. You start with what the game calls the parent, and then you go to the child. And this is covered by the in-game tutorials. The parent is sort of the base, and the child is the periphery object, is another way of thinking about it. So you click there, drag it across, and click on the child. Now, this is not going to move quite the way I want it to because of the orientation of the joint. That pink bit there is the important part. So you just grab that and move it more or less to the center for something like this. Sometimes you don't want it in the center, but in this case I do. And now this moves pretty much the way I want it to. Another thing that's important to do right now for this purpose is if I play time, suddenly that's hanging and swinging, and that is not going to work for the way I want this animation to go. Sometimes you would want it for an animation, and you might want that for something that has player interactivity. But the reason that happened is that when I connected from the parent object to the child object, it made the child object movable, and that happens by default. So here, by default, this is off, and it has been turned on by virtue of it becoming a child object. And that will happen every time you do this connection. And for this particular purpose, it's important to turn that off. And so now, if I play time, it doesn't dangle and get weird looking that way. So it is the same process then, all the way down with each of these joints to use that ball connector. And in this case, I am honestly not 100% sure if it matters whether you start at the top and go to the bottom, but I have had some other instances where I found that that just made everything a lot easier. So I recommend doing it in that way. Think of whatever's the sort of starting point, do that point last. I'm going to jump down to the very end, the very last piece here. I have this little circular bit here that's very small and sort of hidden there. That comes into play for the final joint in this whole structure. So as we go down from one to the next, we just connect all of these pieces. The last one needs to be connected to something that is a completely non-moving object, not part of the animation, and that sort of acts as an anchor point for everything else, so that when you stick this tendril onto the side of a larger vine, this is the point that you anchor it by, everything else moves around it. You could also choose to leave that part out and actually use a connector to anchor this to the vine directly. I like to have this little anchor point because I find that makes it easier, but that's down to personal style. I'm going to exit out of here now, and now that I've gone over the basics of the ball joint connectors, and I'm going to move on to another component of the Magic Beanstalk, which is the animated bean cluster. This is a little bit more complex than the tendril, and I'm just going to go over some of the elements in it. So I'll just play this up close. If I play time, you can see the whole thing is growing, the flowers are opening. The whole thing is still continuing to get bigger as the beans come out. There's some downward movement there. This is done following the same premise as the growing tendril. It's just more things happening, but all in repetition, a lot of cloning happening still. This is made out of components that I created during beta, and I'm just going to show those very briefly. The bean flowers was where I started, and this is not an animation, it's just a sculpture. There's also this individual bean that I created, which has a leaf on it, and the leaf is its own independent object over here. This is the leaf that gets used repeatedly on the Magic Beanstalk vine. So in making the animated bean flowers, the first thing I did, again, just like with the cherry tree that Vex Doppel made, was to remix, in this case remixing my own creation to save a new version. And I had grouped it together originally, so ungrouping that. And now looking at the individual components, there's sort of two shapes happening here. There's the open flower and the closed flower. The closed flower is not really a concern because I need the open flower, and I need it to change from being closed to open. And rather than sort of doing a stop motion style with a whole bunch of different sculpts, I'm using the method of connectors. But if I scope in here, you can see this bean flower and the stem are all one shape. They're all one sculpt made out of a few different shapes. So that's not really going to be able to be animated as it is. I can make it sort of hinge off of the stem and move up and down. But I needed this top part of the flower and the bottom part to be able to open like a clamshell and then also be separate from the stem. So what I had to do was to break this down into 3 parts. Now, of course, that is not very good for the gameplay thermometer, and that's why the final Magic Beanstalk takes up about 1/3 of the total gameplay thermometer, because there's so many tiny little moving parts in it. So to break this down, there's different ways you could do this, but I chose to just make clones and sort of break it into pieces. So I would make one part be the top of the flower and one part be the bottom, and start by just sort of going in and deleting some shapes, and there's a basic bit of the bottom and then a basic bit of the top. I went to more trouble to make these match up with a little bit of extra sculpting in the final version, and then cloning once more here. So now I have a stem there, and then removing the stem out of the other components. And now there's my flower, top, bottom, and stem. And then the way that I built these individual flowers, I actually used a hinge on the flower itself. It could also have been done with a ball joint, but I thought that sorry, I said a hinge, a bolt is what I meant, which can act as a hinge. So going again from parent to child, I decided the parent would be the bottom portion here. The child is the upper. And that actually would work a little bit better if I started on the inside here. And now it's actually rotating the wrong way. And when I did this in the final version, I used the grid so that I could orient this center bit really precisely. But basically, you just rotate it around and you see the axis there. And now that's showing how it's going to act. So using the same method of keyframes and sort of working backwards as I did with the cherry tree sculpt, I did this with one flower and then duplicated it out. So I have this part that can open and close, and it also changes scale. These two now are connected, and of course, important again to go back and turn off the movability. Oops. When I did this previously, I think I also made the whole thing bigger so that it was a little easier to work on. Ball joint now going from the stem to the base of the flower. And now this can move around, and then the last thing I did was another ball joint that goes from the main stem to the little flower stem. And then all of those could be animated separately on the timeline. I'm going to go back now to the final animation so that I can show the rest of the parts, because it is just a lot of perfecting little details and getting it to look just the way that you want it to individually. So as you can see, I have all of these different timelines. Each of these timelines is for one of those flowers. So if we spin this around here and just play this timeline, oops, well, that's not really working. Oh, there we go. You can see, let me do that again. If we just play this timeline, you can see the flower coming out and opening. It stays open for a moment, and then it sort of fades away and the bean comes out. And most of what's happening there is just a change in scale and movement. And the other thing that's happening is that I do have a little bit of changing the looseness on the flower itself as it opens up, and that just makes it look a little bit withered. So as we move along here and the flower is diminishing, you can see it's getting, oops, I have to scope in a little bit farther here. The looseness is going from 0 to 15% in that little change. And it does look a little bit loose to begin with, and that's because I've used the sculpture detail tool, which it's always good to use that before changing the looseness, but you can animate the looseness for some very cool effects. And so the rest of this playing back is just subtleties of movement and scale. And I use the same method of starting sort of at the top and working my way to the bottom of the whole structure. And there's just some tilting happening here. Another important point to mention is that when you're doing keyframes, you don't have to try and cram everything into a minimal number of keyframes. They take very little space on the thermometer, and if it's more convenient to do multiple keyframes for a few actions rather than a bunch of actions onto one keyframe, then definitely don't hesitate to do that. Right here, I have all these timelines. Each of these is just a few keyframes on one timeline. Each timeline, again, is for one of these flowers that sprouts little beans. And then for the whole object, it grows a little bit and then it kind of falls with the weight of the beans. So we have this keyframe here, it extends a little bit, and then this keyframe here makes it fall a little bit. So rather than trying to fit those somehow into the other timelines for the flowers, I just have separate keyframes there. And that often allows you more freedom and flexibility later on if you decide to sort of freestyle it, make some unexpected changes to your animation. I think that's a good way to go. Each of these beans is attached to the same stem as the flower. So the stem is remaining as the same object. The flower components just get very tiny and then they're covered up. They're still there inside of the bean, but you can't see them there. So that is the basics of doing relative movement with connectors. In the next video, I'll go over combining a bunch of animated features like this into something larger and more complex, like the Magic Beanstalk.